So I'd like to introduce for you our speaker today. With us is Justin Wisely. Justin shared with me as we're having lunch that he grew up here in Livermore, graduated from Granada, and got an AA at Las Positas, and then undergraduate degree at Cal State Sacramento, and then graduate degree at Chico State. His topic today is East Bay Archaeology within the context of California archaeology. Justin Wisely is a professional archaeologist working in California and the Great Basin. He works with Pacific Legacy Incorporated, doing cultural resource management for various clients that include Caltrans, PG&E, and FEMA. He specializes in groundstone analysis and starch grain analysis, a subfield of paleobotany. Justin is the son-in-law of our Livermore Branch 101 member, Rick Morrow. And I want to thank Rick for lining up Justin to be our speaker this month. Rick is 2 for 2. He was responsible for getting us our speaker, Brooke Weatherspoon, last month. And I just say again, as little sir, I really appreciate the help from different members in lining up speakers and not having it fall only on myself. So again, thank you, Rick, really appreciate it. So with that, I'd like to welcome our speaker today, Justin Wisely.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. Hello everyone, I'm Justin Wisely. And today I'm going to kind of talk about archaeology in California in general. Well, there's a whole variety of projects that we do for these. So this is a kind of a general outline of what I'm going to be talking about. I'll start with the California region, and then I'll move into the East Bay tribal language areas, because that's what we're here to hear about, East Bay archaeology. East Bay tribal areas, according to the Native American Heritage Commission, which we'll kind of get into a little bit. A brief introduction to some of the more important cultural resource laws of why do we get to do what we do. Some project examples of the variety of projects that we get to be involved with. An overview of some East Bay sites, just kind of where they're at and some of the research for the area. I chose Los Vaqueros because it's actually had some extensive research done there, and it's close to where the hiking group goes in Morgan Territory, and there's a lot of traffic back and forth between the Central Valley and the East Bay between tribal groups. So it's a good transition area for some research. And then there's my particular favorite, which is one of my specialties, is bedrock milling. A lot of you have seen these bedrock milling features while hiking around Morgan Territory and some of the other East Bay sites. And they're particularly important to me because I study them. And how I study them is with starch grain analysis, which I'll get into a good summary of that. But it's basically I go and I take distilled water and a sonic toothbrush, and I go and clean these mortars, and I take the samples back to the lab, and I tell you what they were grinding on. So kind of starting with an overview of California archaeology. This is a map from Jones and Clark, 2007. It's California Prehistory. It is a book that kind of took over the reins from the previous textbook on California archaeology that was produced by Morado in 1984 that covered a lot of the early research. We've been very lucky in California that we have extensive research that has been conducted since the early 20th century. With Kroeber at Berkeley and finding Ishii and a lot of the research that's been done. Berkeley really kind of took the reins on a lot of this research, especially with 30s and 40s, really documenting lost volume. Really documenting a lot of the cultural.
Hold on.
Oh,
it might be the battery, man. So
I can project.
Apologize. So about your last 3 or 4 sentences. Let's try that again.
Very good.
Sorry about that.
Oh, thank you. So like I was saying though, Berkeley, the University of Berkeley really took the reins early on in California archaeology, and they sent out students and archaeologists throughout the state to these different regions. My pointer's not seeming to be working here. So we're over here in region 5, and 3B is kind of the Central Valley Delta region that you can kind of see. I'll use the pointer. So we're here in region 5, which is the San Francisco Bay region. And then we also have a lot of interactions with 3B, which is the Delta Central Valley region. So there's a lot of movement between those two regions, both linguistically and archaeologically. Oh. Let me go back a second here. So that's kind of the focus of this talk, is the East Bay and some of the Central Valley. But how we determine these areas, in a lot of ways, it's linguistically. California has hundreds of native languages that were documented throughout California. The Bay Area has some of the more complex ones where we have various groups. But here you can see, if we're in the San Francisco Bay Coast-to-Noan language group. And to the south we have the Mutsun, Waswas. And we have several missions in here. We've got the Ama Mutsun Rumsen. Some very nice people down there. Anne-Marie says, if you ever get to go to Indian Canyon, she's a Ohlone down there and is a wealth of knowledge. But yeah, so a lot of this is based on where the language is spoken versus where the archaeology necessarily was, because the borders between these groups were a lot more fluid than a lot of the maps would indicate. So we based a lot of the boundaries on the language, spoken language, versus the archaeological record when we were determining boundaries for these Native Americans. This map is actually from Victor Goya, 2011, who did significant research on Native American languages and helped determine a lot of these boundaries. This is a map, actually, for those of you who are interested in this. This is a map that's available to you online. It's from the Native American Heritage Commission, and this is where tribes have self-identified their own regions, as well as using the linguistical data that you saw on the previous slide with Victor Goya, to help determine what areas of California are important to them. Because we actually, on a lot of these projects, we have to consult with the Native Americans on impacts from the project to the resources. There's a whole system in place for when we have a project, we have to notify the Native American Heritage Commission. They send back us a list of names that we have to contact to see if they're interested in being a part of the project, if they have anything to say about it, or if they have any information that isn't in the archaeological record per se. But again, it's Coast-to-Noan, Ohlone for most of this area. And then we're bordered on the eastern side of the Central Valley with the Yokits, particularly the Northern Valley Yokits. Okay, that lined up good. So these are just the big cultural resource laws. We have laws going back in time to the Antiquities Act, the Organic Act, but the one that I get to play with all the time is the National Historic Preservation Act, specifically Section 106, which requires federal agencies or project proponents on federal lands or using federal money, they have to follow this law, which is identifying impacts from a project on cultural resources. So this is how I actually get paid, because these laws require it. The typical clients that we have are Caltrans and PG&E. Caltrans has agreements with the Federal Highways Administration, as well as some of the other federal agencies that we have to identify the impacts from these projects before we can actually let them go. So the typical project process, I won't go into too many details, but we review the project, we do a surface survey to identify if there's any resources on the surface. If we don't find anything and it's been determined sensitive, we might do some geoarchaeological studies, which is usually trenching or coring to find any buried sites. California has a long history of soil movement, and we have sites that have been found in California that are buried 30 to 40 feet. Specifically, some of them have actually been found in the San Francisco Bay, covered by bay mud, because as the bay developed, sites were buried by the bay mud, and then during historic times, when the land was reclaimed with historic fill, it then extended beyond that. So now that we have the historic fill in place, we can core down and find these prehistoric sites that were previously submerged. The evaluation phase is, if we find a site, we have to determine if it's significant or not. Not every site's going to be significant. Some of them are just sparse lithic scatters, like flakes, that don't really have much data to them. But on sites that we do determine that are eligible for the National Registry, they're significant, we have to do data recovery, which is more extensive excavations. So we really start small holes, we figure out boundaries, then we'll dig up more of it to see, how important is this site? And then if there's integrity. And if there is integrity and we get data, we do data recovery. So that's a lot of the word salad part. The rest of this is mostly photos, so bear with me. All right, Caltrans Geoarchaeology. So this is a project that I was part of on Highway 80 in Davis. And what we're doing here is we are taking geoarchaeological test trenches in areas that have been determined sensitive for buried cultural resources. So California archaeology goes back 10, 12, almost 14,000 years, depending on which site you're looking at. In the context of age, there has been nicotine tobacco seeds identified in a hearth feature in Utah that dated to over 12,000 years. So not only were they here 12,000 years ago, but they had been here long enough to identify tobacco and know that they could smoke it. So there are a lot of buried sites in California. We find them all the time during quarrying and during trenching activities. So here we have tobacco kind of starting the trench. They spoil into the pile. We take rakes and we just rake through the dirt. If we find anything, we stop and we screen it, and we'll document it in the field. This other photo is a completed trench. We usually go down about 10 feet or sometimes deeper with the trench, and then we'll document the sidewalls. We pull soil samples from the different levels as they come out so that we can document the soil morphology of the region to better refine the sensitivity. But the sensitivity is based on a lot of the movement of water. So in this map, I'm not sure if you can read the key, but the potential for buried resources in this area is the dark, kind of medium to dark green. And the reason why it's higher sensitivity is because the river that's going through here is the Sacramento River, and the green area is a lot of the migration path of that river over time. So it'll go back and forth, it can migrate, expand, shrink over the years, and every time it does this, anybody living near the river, they might live there 1 year, the next year their site is buried. So we actually find a lot of buried sites in this region. And Livermore has a lot of the similar aspects. This is just a very good example of kind of the movement of the river. You can see this in Livermore with the arroyo. There's going to be a lot of sites that are potentially buried in the arroyo, so every time you're walking or riding a bike down there, there's a good chance you're going to find something. But that's kind of the general idea of geoarchaeological sensitivity. So find a lot of that. The other one is bridges. A lot of the old bridges tended to like to borrow from one side to build up the approach from the other side. So there have been cases nearby where the bridge approach had a burial site, and they took burials from one side and used it to build up the other side. So then we have to go out and mitigate that when they're doing upgrades to the bridges. But this is one of my favorite types of projects to do, is PG&E hydropower for relicensing. They're long-term projects. You get to do some really cool archaeology, and you get to go to some very fun areas and do some really fun things. Like, this one is one of my favorites because this was a helicopter survey that I was doing at Kirkhoff Lake down in the Western Mono Territory on the western side of the Sierras. And the reason I recorded this is I'm trying to determine where I can survey when we're doing the kayak survey the next day. Trying to find the spots that aren't going to be too steep. And as we kind of approach, we're in a helicopter about 10 feet above the water. So it's a very exciting archaeology, and these guys land in the weirdest places. Prior to this, they dropped us off in the ravine, and we had to hike our way up to the dam to get back to the helicopter. But now we're getting into the area where I was able to determine that we can survey some of the shoreline for some of these resources. And then during the kayak survey, we're going to come up on an island here that we had to boat to survey this island. And now he's actually going to start extending up. And we surveyed all this shoreline, and if you look under into the water, there's a bunch of bedrock milling features buried, submerged under the water in this area. Unfortunately, they're really difficult to photograph through the water. So, but as we're flying over, you're going to see a little island near a bridge. That island has a bunch of bedrock milling features on it. That's a historic bridge, and so this island right here, this big one, has several sites on it. Also has a lot of snakes on it. And that little rocky island that you saw had footings for the original historic era bridge. But as part of this project, we get to do helicopter rides, we do boat surveys, we get to work with the Native Americans doing surveys. I got to work with the botanical crew doing ethnobotany surveys to try and help them determine cultural collection areas. So as you guys are out hiking, you're going to be, even in Oregon Territory or some of these other East Bay regions, you're going to come across some sites and you're not even going to know them. But you're going to be there and you're going to see a plant community that doesn't look quite right. And a lot of times, there's a site nearby. One of the typical markers for me is soap root. If you're on this hike and you're not seeing soap root anywhere, but then all of a sudden you come on a big grouping of soap root, there's a likelihood that there's bedrock milling nearby, because they would take the soap root and they would make brushes out of them. And they would use those brushes in the mortars to clean out the flour. So there's some signs of this archaeology that's out there that is just missed, that you wouldn't know about unless you were really looking for it. But we also deal with historics. This is another project-related find that we had, and this is a historic area incinerator that was part of the construction of the powerhouse. As you can see, it's built kind of piecemeal from different bricks and rocks, and there's some rail on there, some stovepipe. They just kind of cobbled it together. But it was an incinerator that was used for years. So we deal with both historics and prehistoric archaeology. Here is another site along the reservoir that actually has, you can kind of see how it's been eroding away. So the site is actually on the surface, but out of the wall of this, you're seeing a bunch of artifacts, and you can actually see some on the photo here. There's some brownstone artifacts that have now dropped into the reservoir because it's been eroding this away. So you can see stuff like this at Dow Val potentially, or any of the other local reservoirs. If there are sites near them, when the reservoirs get drawn down, look at the cut banks. You might be able to see some cool stuff. But again, please, if you find something, just leave it alone. It's fine to look at. But I have to say no collecting, please. I know that, leave it for the next person, or the agency might already know about it and have a plan in place for it. This is some other historic area discoveries that we've had. This one on the left is a historic area ditch. These guys were really good back in the 1800s at digging ditches. They could actually follow the contour line of a slope really well. We have a lot of these that we find that were built in the 1850s and 1860s for mining, that they match the modern topo maps. And then here is actually something that, for the hiking group again, I wish but back in the back there is an adit, and that is mined out into the hillside. And in front of it is a historic area ditch. Now to the left of it, you can see some stacked rocks kind of on the left. That is part of a check dam where they stored water to use in the mining operations. That would then funnel it down the ditch. But now, as you can see, it's a hiking path for people, and they walk right by the adit. So when you guys are out hiking, you might see stuff like this. There's Nortonville, which is in kind of the Moraga area that had a lot of mining and stuff. So keep your eyes peeled for it. It was throughout California, and be safe because some of these adits and shafts can be quite dangerous. And then San Francisco, again for buried resources, and just some of the archaeology here. What is now the Embarcadero used to be Yerba Cove. And it's kind of hard to see in this one. I thought it would come through better. But there's Rincon Point, which is kind of near Spear in Maine. They filled that entire area in with ships and historic fill. But previously, there were shipbreaking yards there. There was prehistoric archaeology as well. This map is 1892. It's the Faust map. It's available online, actually. And for those of you who travel in the city, do yourself a favor, don't look at how many transit systems they had available back then, because it was better than we have now. So every time I look at the map, I see, I'm like, oh man, I wish we had these still. Because they actually serviced most of the city, and it was a really nice rail system. But here is the view of the Charles Hare Shipbreaking Yard at Spear and Folsom. So when you're in the city, if you're at Spear and Folsom, this was 18 feet below you at the time. That's how filled in it's become. I know that because we found this drift pin that was removed from a ship at about 18 feet below the surface. We also found cordage and tree nails. Now I'm not sure if everyone knows about shipbuilding and stuff, but that drift pin is used to keep timbers together. And these tree nails were hammered into different ship components as well to keep ship pieces together. And because of the waterlogged nature of this particular project area, they were quite well preserved. But this was the deepest portion of what we found. Every layer in the Soma area of San Francisco, we would get wood sewers, brick sewers, cobblestones, paver stones, planked roads, planked sidewalks, and instead of pulling it up and redoing it, they would just build on top of it. So there's planked sidewalks and roads that are 5-8 feet below the modern surface, especially on Folsom Street. So when you're out there, you could be walking over a basement that extends under the road that's 10 feet down. Because they realigned the roads, they widened the streets, so they actually took over a lot of the space from the houses on these areas. But there's prehistoric archaeology there too. This was also found in San Francisco. This picture in the middle is a prehistoric mortar. Loosely we call these portable mortars, but they're not actually all that portable. This is a very heavy boulder. If I remember correctly, it was probably about 80 to 100 pounds at least. So I wouldn't really consider it portable per se. But it was found in this small lot of a project area in San Francisco. They were doing some excavations and out pops this mortar. And so I was actually not part of this project in the city. I was the one who sampled the mortar for its residue. They sent me these photos to kind of get more familiar with the project area. Here's some other close-ups of it. You can see the cleaner portion in the middle. That's where I sampled it for residues to try and determine what was being ground in it. And I know in California, there's always been the assumption that it's acorn. What this mortar yielded was actually Baltic brush seed and Calochortus, which is Mariposa lily. So anyone familiar with hiking in the spring, if you see the Mariposa lily or the fairy lanterns, they were eating the bulbs and they were grinding them up. And then they were taking brush seeds and grinding those up. In the Bay Area here, in the East Bay, one of the more important resources is actually grass seed. I find grass seed in a lot of milling contexts for portable groundstone as well as bedrock milling features. Comically enough, the thing I find the least is probably acorn. So it just kind of shows that there were a lot of other resources being eaten here beyond acorn. But East Bay archaeology, we have a lot of the Contra Costa sites along the waterfront. A lot of those were mound sites that were documented in the early 20th century and then later leveled. A lot of excavations occurred at them, but a lot of artifacts were recovered from them. And then of interest probably to this group here is Alameda 565, which is in Seminole. This is actually a resource. This is actually a resource that was at the water temple. There was a multitude of burials removed. There was a village site there. They had these flower pot mortars that were not necessarily mortars, but they were used for storage. They're about the size. They're made out of stone, and they're about the size of a half keg. And they had asphaltum or bitumen around the lip of them for both sealing them and for decorating them. They would put beads along the edge. A lot of times the beads would be separated from them over time, but they'd be decorated with beads and other bone and other materials. But you've got some sites in Livermore, you've got some sites in Pleasanton right there, and these are sites where substantial research has been done. A lot of excavations, a lot of data recovery, so there's a good amount of knowledge about the archaeology out here. And one of the examples is Los Vaqueros. So this is extracted from Meyer and Rosenthal in '97. And this is just I found this to be a very good example of some of the flakestone that you may encounter on some of your hikes. There are two images here. The one on the left is, we call them bifixes. It's just flakestone that it's a kind of a multi-tool. They shape it and they sharpen it and they use it as a knife, a hatchet, all different activities with it. But one of the ones that you guys will see is in the upper right corner. You see that very serrated point? That is called a Stockton serrate. It is very well known for the Central Valley area, but you will also find them here. Typically broken. So if you see a piece of obsidian and you see this serrated edge, know that you've probably at least found a Stockton serrate, which is it's an arrowhead used in the last 1,000 to 1,500 years. The bow and arrow didn't come to California until about 1,500 years ago, and it kind of wound its way through the state. The typical assumption is that it came from the Great Basin, and it's a technology that was developed there and kind of introduced into California. California, for the longest time, used dart and atlatl technology, which is on the right side. These are larger projectile points that would have been hafted to a dart and thrown with an atlatl. And they're a lot chunkier, they're a lot heavier, and there's a good amount of variety in them. They would be reshaped if somebody was working on one and it got partially damaged, they would rework the edge. So there's a good amount of variation in some of these points. But my particular specialty is groundstone. So we'll see, you may find these along your hikes. This is a pestle, and this is another pestle. So there's a lot of variety in them. They're different sizes, different materials. A lot of times they can look like just like river cobbles. Other times they're more significantly shaped and formalized. I did work in one area up near Marysville where they actually took the rock that was exfoliating from the boulder. They took that rock off, used it as a pestle to make a mortar, and then they used it to cap the mortar again. So when you walk up to it, you can't see any mortars. They're all hidden by the rocks that they used. But when you pick it up and you look at the mortar, you can see the pestle right on it. So some of this stuff was pretty well concealed. The pestle on the left is up at Meadow Lake at 8,000 feet, where I have actually found acorn in mortars. This is another example of a pestle that I've sampled. And this particular bedrock milling feature on the right is a boulder milling feature that was found in the McCollum River. It's actually in the river on a small island, and it's just a whole collection of bedrock milling features in the island. And it's around 3,500 feet, which becomes important because as we go up in elevation, you start to see these resources moving from the lowlands into the highlands of California. So you'll see things that are in the valley of Livermore, and they're probably being carried up to Brushy Peak and some of the other surrounding areas and being processed up there. So bedrock milling features. You guys see these on your hikes. There's been a lot of research done on them over the years. The biggest assumption was that they were mostly used for acorn. Mark Baskel in 1987 published an article on balanophagy, which is the consumption of acorn. There's actually a word for it. And he argued that the number and depth of the mortars was the use of acorn. He argued that the more mortars you had, the deeper they were, the more acorn people were eating. Which sounds kind of boring, having just one thing to eat all the time. Helen McCarthy, though, for her dissertation in '93, working with the Mono, found that, no, they use these things for a lot of different resources. They did use them for acorns still as well, but we had starter mortars that were used to kind of break up the acorn into smaller pieces, and then the finishing mortars actually ground it up into a powder to make a flour with it. And then she determined that the large, really deep mortars were actually for small seeds. Part of my thesis dissertation, or thesis project, was testing this. And what I actually found was that starter mortars and finishing mortars were used for acorn. But we see grass seed and geophytes across the board in these mortars. So you're seeing small grass seeds like needlegrass, wild rye, brome grass in all of these. We do find a lot of Mariposa lilies, and I'm sure people have been walking around and they've seen Harvest Rhodea and Blue Dix. We find a lot of those in these. And I'm not sure if people are familiar with hollyleaf cherry, but the pit is actually pretty starchy, and I found it in archaeological contexts all over the state. So bedrock milling. This one on the left is at 8,000 feet, and I've actually found acorn in one of those mortars, which for us was exciting because it indicates the storage over the winter of acorn. You know, you're not going to be at this site at 8,000 feet in the fall or the winter. So what it indicated was people were collecting acorn in the fall, storing it down slope, and they were carrying it all the way up the slope in the spring or summer, and they were grinding it here. This is another photo of me sampling the mortar. So I developed this kind of kit where it's got single-use pipettes, a sonic toothbrush, and centrifuge tubes with distilled water to kind of clean the surface of the mortars, extract them. I take them back to the lab and process them, and then analyze them under a microscope. This is another example of bedrock milling features. This one is around 5,000 feet. This is actually a Big Tree State Park. It's the first bedrock milling feature I ever sampled in the state. And the road bisects a fairly large village site. That's pretty well protected, thankfully. But as you can see here, there's a bunch of different size mortars. Where the water's filling up, there's actually some milling slits, which are kind of missed in a lot of archaeology. You'll see the mortars because they're pretty clear, but a lot of times when you see these mortars, there's going to be a smooth area right next to them that's typically about this big. And people were using that to remove a lot of the chaff from the grass seeds and a lot of the other materials. So you'll see milling slicks, which is a very nice smoothing of the rock next to the mortar. This is a sketch of the mortar that we do, and then we document it with depth and what's in it and everything. And this is kind of standard protocol. So when you see these out in the wild, we photograph them, we have to sketch them, and we really document them so that they can be relocated and studied later on. So we also get a type. So the CM stands for conical mortar, we get saucer-shaped mortars. There's just a lot of variation in them, and a lot of these different variations tend to be functional. So this is the sampling kit of how we do this. So we take a pre-filled tube of distilled water out in the field, we pour that in the mortar, we sonicate it with a toothbrush. We use the single-use pipette to remove the sample, put it back in the tube, we mark the convenience, and that's what we carry back to the lab. In the lab, we do a heavy liquid flotation. So starches have a specific gravity of 1.3 or 1.7. So we make a heavy liquid, and we add that to the sample. It makes the starches float when we put it in a centrifuge. We pipette that off, and then that's what we mount to our slides to look at under the microscope. We use a polarizing microscope to identify them. So these are some early images that I took for my modern comparative collection to identify these starches, because we didn't have a comparative collection in California yet. So what I did was I took modern comparative plants, ground them up, mounted them to slides, and documented them in a microscope. And these are just some of the better examples of them. The images on the bottom are cross-polarized light. Images on top are bright field. These were taken at roughly 400 times magnification to give you an idea of the scale. We're typically identifying them at 15 to 30 microns in size. But these are some of my favorite ones, and they've all been identified in archaeological record. The yellow star tulip, which is a Mariposa lily, is a geophyte, underground storage organ. Then we also have California buckeye, which has been identified in mortars and in dental calculus. So we know that they were eating it. This is the hollyleaf cherry pit, this little triad here. And each of these grains form in a very specific way based on genetics and environment. So we know that if we find this archaeologically, we know what we're looking at. These are some of the typical results that we have. I'm sorry about the split screen. I find juncus, which is rush, in almost every project I've done. I find a limus in almost every project I've done. Some of the groundstone I've done in San Jose had a lot of wild rye. I identified a lot of wild rye in Shalami Valley, down in kind of the Central Coast area. We also find a lot of californis in the East Bay and in the Central Valley. Blue dates, as I mentioned. And then we do find acorn, we find buckeye, and we find hollyleaf cherry. But by any means, it's the small grass seeds that I find the most, which I find very interesting considering that acorn has been like the most prominent resource that's talked about. So thank you. This is me sampling that mortar up at Meadow Lake. And you can kind of see the lake behind. And before this was a reservoir, there was a drainage that came down, which is why the mortar's there. It's typically near water. But yeah, thank you guys for covering this. Open to any questions on anything.
Let me bring you the mic for your questions. Art, your hand was up first.
Have you done anything at the Tesla town site up by Carnegie SVRA?
I have not done any starch sampling, but I actually did monitor up there for PG&E. But I've not done any testing or sampling up at Carnegie or Tesla. That's kind of a contentious area at the moment.
Yeah, you mentioned the Sonoma site around the water temple, and KQED PBS has a really good documentary about that site and the people that live there. And we hiked in that area, as a lot of people do. So you can do a search on the PBS app if you happen to have that. And it's very good.
Nice. Thank you.
I have a question about languages. You said there were hundreds of different languages in the area. Did you find any common root to that that would perhaps allow different speakers to still communicate?
So there were a few common roots, but the language also helps indicate that there were multiple migrations in. So there were, like, here we have the Venusian language that came in at one point in time. But there's these pockets of different migrations. So there wouldn't always be a universal-based language to them. There's actually an area in Northwest California where that language matches a tribal group from the Michigan area. And it's just a pocket, it's near Covelo. It's just a pocket of this one language group. But they would come in at different times, and they would usually end up developing some kind of like pidgin or kind of crossover to be able to communicate. And then different tribes would learn the different tribes' languages as well. But you'd also see this kind of with intermarrying, and you'd see it with the different tribal groups where it would kind of merge a little bit, but then you would get some common words. Does that answer your question?
Sure.
So I'm the botanical guy.
Here we go, here's the one for you.
I'd always imagined that it would be really difficult to move acorns around, especially up slope without any beasts of burden. How did they do that?
Just packs and bags, and they would carry them up. They'd make a lot of baskets.
It takes a fair amount of acorns to support a person for a month.
It would, but if they're supplementing it with other resources that are local,
Is that worth it?
well, it can be. I mean, you know, we all go to the mountains in the summer when it's really hot in the valley. That's part of the reason they go up there. And migration, because on the Sierra and the Crest, you actually have the Washoe coming over from the Great Basin, coming over and spending a winter with the Miwok, and then going back and forth. So there was a lot of mobility over the Sierra and the Crest.
I have another question. How much do we know about how people moved into California at first? Did they come down the coast? Did they come from an inland, across the Sierras? How did they do that?
Well, the consensus is that we had multiple migrations. That's why there's such a variety in the language groups. We had people coming in through, you know, some of the glacial openings, but there's a lot of people think that there were some boat migrations as well. You know, the Bering Land Bridge is one of the main theories that still holds water. Sorry, excuse me. But we're still refining the early migrations. Like I mentioned, the nicotine sea in Utah, every time we find something new, we're pushing back the dates on the earliest occupation. I wouldn't be surprised if we find occupations even farther back than that.
Have you done any work with the areas along the Pacific that would have been during the Ice Age out shoreline and now underwater? So it gets a little hard to find, but have you played in that area?
I've played around in the Pacific Northwest a little bit, not on too many older sites, because a lot of those, as you mentioned, are likely submerged under the water by now. But we are actually starting to get into that. California is kind of catching up to kind of the East Coast, where we're finally developing an underwater archaeology program in California to work alongside the California Coastal Commission and some of the reservoirs in our inland to deal with some of these submerged resources. And some of the impetus for this is the offshore wind projects that are getting discussed, because the transition zone from that power supply coming in could impact buried sites in the bay or along the coastline. But most of them aren't well recorded.
Another question here.
I got a question.
Do you have any comments on the Golden Village area up on Morgan Territory? And there's just I know there's a website that or blog that a lot of us are familiar with. It seems like there is controversy on access to the site, to a lot of things about those mills.
Yes, I know there's a publication out there that is somewhat problematic in providing site locations. And that's one of the reasons I think that the access has been limited to those is once a site is known about, they have to spend more time protecting it. But East Bay Regional Parks has an archaeologist on staff, actually several I believe, that helps maintain those sites and they kind of monitor them. We also have, through state parks, we have a site stewardship program that if people are interested in becoming a site steward, they train you how to observe a site, how to record any impacts to it, and train you to help monitor it. If people are interested in volunteering and helping with protecting some of these resources. It's a lot of the controversy is juggling something like this, which is like public outreach and education, educating people about the archaeology in California while also protecting it. So we're very careful about providing too much site location data. Some of the ones I've used are pretty well-known sites to a lot of folks. So, I don't know. Did that answer it?
Did you happen to do any work at the site for the site's reservoir up north?
Which reservoir?
The site's reservoir? It's something starting to be built fairly soon. It's,
No, I haven't done anything at the site's reservoir.
okay.
Let me get. We'll do one more question here. I'm getting the signal we're going to wrap pretty soon.
Oh, yeah.
But go ahead.
This go on for hours. When I was about 10, we vacationed for a week at a friend's cabin on the American River off US 50, just upstream from where Ice House Road comes in. And down in the riverbed were a bunch of boulders that had fairly large diameter, what looked like water pits, but they were on the order of maybe 8 inches diameter to a foot. And I understood that those were naturally caused by rocks being swirled in the stream of the water during runoff times. Much bigger than what you show in your photos. Would those have been used also by the Native Americans, do you think? I suppose they've all been washed out from running water since.
Good question. Combination answer. Sometimes we actually find mortars that were built into those natural occurrences, but also some of the larger ones. I noticed for geological folks, there's actually in the Sierra Nevadas upstream on the Mokelumne River, there's the salt basins that are meter-wide basins that were potentially used for salt production. But it might have also, some people think that they were natural, but we're still trying to kind of dial in what they look man-made.
Very good. And then early on, you had photos of your helicopter right over a reservoir that appeared to be from the vegetation in the Mother Lode area. I missed where that was.
Well, that was Kirkhoff Lake?
Oh, no, that wouldn't cover.
What county is that?
Madera.